And so now it gives me great pleasure to open our program this morning with a presentation by Dr. Serena King, who is the professor of psychology at Hamline University in St. Paul. She's our homegrown, internationally recognized expert on gaming and gambling, mentored by Randy Stinchfield and Dr. Jeff Daravinsky, both noted experts in youth gambling. Mind you, there's not much funding available for gambling research, but when we can, we try to support efforts to gain better understanding to this issue. For decades, MNAPG has supported the analysis of the Minnesota Student Survey, and today Serena will reflect on her insights into current trends in gambling and gaming amongst Minnesota high school students, as well as explore the national trends and emerging forms of gambling being marketed to young audiences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Serena King. Come on up.
Good morning. Well, thank you all for showing up on this cold day in Minnesota. I'm really excited to share with you the insights from the Minnesota Student Survey and take you on a tour of what youth gambling research has shown us in, say, the last 5 to 10 years. And things have changed a great deal, as you'll see soon here. The first thing I want to mention is, despite our greatest hopes of having 2025 data from the Minnesota Student Survey today, we do not have that data in hand yet. We do have data to share from 2022. The Minnesota Student Survey has not released the data yet or the press release on that data. And so the minute that we have that data in hand, we'll be doing work on that survey to get the most up-to-date research in your hands. So today we're going to be talking about what the gambling field and youth gambling research can tell us about how we take action. And I'll also have, of course, local data from Minnesota to share with you, because, of course, as we understand gambling and its uniqueness in the addiction space, we know that local issues are critical and local trends are critical. So the first thing I want to talk about is the impact on digital technology for our young people. And one of the things that I want you to think about as you think about gambling is its intersection with digital technology addictions, right? So our kids are growing up online. A lot of what they do, gaming, social media, all of this is taught to them very early. They're acculturated onto the platforms very early. Social media is an example of this. Gaming is an example of this as well. And as has already been alluded to, video games are building in gambling into their products, and they're gamblifying their products. So kids very early on may be engaging in gambling behavior before they know what gambling behavior really is. And that, I think, is a challenge for us as researchers to assess gambling behavior, because sometimes kids don't know if they're gambling. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is emerging adulthood, and I think our speakers today will speak to this as well, and how does it relate to unique risk for gambling and gaming addiction, right? So we're going to talk about some of the psychological factors that may connect with the teenage brain that make gambling and digital technology addiction so significant for this period of time. So the first thing is, if you've been around kids and particularly adolescents, you know that speed matters. And so within the teenage brain, if you've read about this, you understand that the teenage brain is a fast superhighway. It's wired for speed, and decisions are faster on average for young people than they are for other age groups, right? So wins within games are very immediate, it's fast, and the products are built to be sort of intersect with that need for speed. And then also we have the culture of technology affecting young people, right? Lots of their lives are spent online. You can have a whole lunch or meal where kids are basically interacting online instead of with each other in present moment. In addition, kids learn how to do wagering type activities on these technologies very early. So within video games, we already have microtransactions built in. So the more that kids are acculturated onto video games and other products like this, they might get exposed to early wins, and that could be the hook. So in addition, because the teenage brain is wired for speed, another thing it's wired for is craving reward seeking, right? And these mobile devices are built for reward. I make this joke with my students sometimes that anything from Duolingo to social media can be addictive. Basically, most digital technology products, if you don't have a gamified type reward in your product, you're not going to get the hook. And because these different platforms are built on likes and engagement, et cetera, I mean, it's monetized into these products that we're building in these kinds of reward systems, right? So it's not a very, I guess my point here is it's not a very hard pathway to think about how kids that are already engaging in digital technology could be transported into the gambling world. And we see that in the data. In this chart here, they looked at adults and adolescents and rates of different types of gambling behaviors. And you can see that while, of course, adolescents across the board are engaging in less gambling behaviors overall, you can see that, for example, casino gambling, sports betting, private or non-commercial betting, bingo, the rates of these types of behaviors among adolescents and adults. Adolescents are engaging in these behaviors, some of which are at at different rates or similar rates, if not more than adults. So what do we know about emerging adulthood? Of course, it's a pivotal role transition. Some of the things that we observe as college professors working with emerging adults every day is that students are under a ton of pressure right now. More than ever, in my 20-year career of working with young adults in the college setting at Hamline University, I've watched the number of our young adults who have to take on full-time jobs on top of their full-time education, right? And so not only are they carrying full-time jobs, they are trying to financially get a hold of their own financial concerns and independence, and then balance the stresses of their academic life. And so with that, on top of the engagement with digital technology, it's a natural pathway towards wanting financial benefits from your digital device, right? So if you're struggling with your financial concerns and you're trying to balance things, you're going to want to go to your device, and maybe there's some money in here for me too. So digital native, the fact that they're digital natives, including early and frequent engagement with video gaming platforms and apps, these sorts of natural transitions between gaming, digital technology, and then moving towards wagering makes a lot of sense. Of course, kids at this age have independence from their family, added stressors. Gambling and alcohol and cannabis use may impact their judgment. As we sit at the precipice of opening dispensaries around the state, I think about the legalization of cannabis and how it may or may not impact judgment in emerging adults and choices that are made, including gambling. And then also embedded gambling inside video gaming platforms is much more common than we think. And in fact, we're not tracking that super well in our research. So we do need to do a better job at that. But as Susan has already noted, we don't have as much funding as we need to collect those comprehensive data. Relatively little public school education. This has already been noted. So kids are already on gaming platforms before they've even been taught how to identify what they're doing as gambling or the risks of those platforms. And then deceptive marketing and cross-marketing, youth are much more susceptible to these risks, right? And then I just want to make a note that when we're talking about high schoolers and middle schoolers who may still get exposed to gamified products within video games and other places, mom and dad may not know what's going on the device. Okay, and I'm a mom of a teenager myself, I'm just going to share, and monitoring the devices it's nearly impossible, even when you're trying to be responsible. So I think that being very aware of what do we need to be telling parents about these risks is essential. Now, speaking of risks, they had in the Lancet Public Health article that I showed the graph of, they looked at features related to high-risk gambling for youth and others. And here are some of the features that were highlighted in that article. So the high speed and high event frequency of a product, the reward characteristics or reinforcement mechanisms, the payment or monetary characteristics, including how large the bet size was, the near misses feature or losses feature disguised as wins. And so in products such as social casino games, which were already mentioned, there are unique features of some of these products that make the wins and the losses a little bit confusing for the user or a little bit harder to cognitively process. And then finally, information characteristics such as player involvement, messages suggesting the control of chance, or the ease of gambling. And what's not on this list, but I've been thinking a lot about lately, is the use of AI in these platforms, and chatbots, and RG efforts, so to speak. And this idea that some operators are assuming that we can make safer products using chatbots or using characteristics of a person's play and identifying them as problematic users and letting them know. Without making too many comments about that, I think we aren't there yet. And I'm concerned that we would be using AI prematurely in a lot of places. So let's talk a little bit about developmental considerations for our youth in terms of risk features. Adolescence and young adulthood is a unique period of gambling risk. As I've mentioned, certain features of gambling products make them more addictive. And technologies applied to these products, including artificial intelligence, are also making these products more accessible and addictive. So if I engage with a platform once or twice, they've got me, right? They can knock at my door, they can do a push notification depending on the legality of that. And again, people might be betting on illegal platforms or unregulated or less regulated platforms, and they are getting push notifications and they are getting reminders and they are getting bots, right? And so are we tracking that phenomenon well in our research? I would say probably not. And I do think that it's important for us to understand that now that we are digital, and folks are getting exposed to these things, those become triggers for not only relapse, but also for engaging in more heavy use of these products. And I think particularly youth are at risk for this. So let's talk about advertising, which I think is something that's been getting some attention lately. One of my efforts in my research lab with my team of students is to understand how young people interpret information around finances, but also interpret how ads are presented in front of them. There's been a lot of discussion about how young people are exposed to ads like YouTube ads, social media ads around gambling and gaming. Radio ads are also common now, TV ads, right? And people, regardless, we've all seen these ads. If you buy Netflix for the non-ad-free Netflix, you're going to see these ads. Example of this is the UK has ads coming out of the wazoo. I'm just going to say that. I've talked to folks in the UK. They've got a lot of ads over there. Once a gambling market emerges in a state, right, you're going to see more ads. But you already see the ads. And what do these ads tell you, right? They tell you, come on board. If you do this, you're going to get instant cash, okay? So you have to start to think about who's vulnerable to that. Young people like instant cash, right? But read the fine print, okay? Well, what fine print exists, right? So here's the thing. In an adult developed brain, we understand there's fine print. In a young brain, free cash means free cash, right? So what did Canada do? Canada got a little concerned, or maybe a lot concerned, and doctors at the national level put out a piece that said, the onslaught of sports betting ads makes gambling enticing to youth, and we need to regulate this, right? So, and that came out from the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and they wanted the ads restricted, especially during sports betting, during games, right? Because sports betting, people are doing live betting. So I want to kind of transition a little bit to talk about what do we know about the cognitive psychology of young people and how we can translate that information about how kids take misinformation, particularly around finances, and might use information they hear or see in ads to make decisions. So we know, first of all, kids are more susceptible to online misinformation. And I like to think about ads and misleading ads as a form of misinformation. So children as young as 2 are able to attend to the reliability of people or their environment sharing information, but in terms of misinformation, the development of that quality, that emerges a little bit later on in life. So if kids are sort of digesting misinformation early around wins and losses, either in video gaming platforms or in betting platforms, they may not have the cognitive ability to understand that what they're being offered isn't really a good thing, or that they're actually not going to get cash. And so another article by Philip Newell talks about gambling advertising being inherently misleading. Very few people are really studying this in the research world, and that's something that our lab is really going to be devoted to come the spring, is to look at young people and misinformation and ads. With this, we see that there's a lot of marketing around sports betting and young teens who are at risk being innovated with these gambling ads via YouTube and others. So what's the takeaway here? Emerging adults are susceptible to financial misinformation, and the incentives offered in ads, the gimmies, the come-ons, the big introductory offer, is often the risk is where people get hooked into that game, right? In addition, lots of kids are seeing other kids bet on sports, right? So if there's a community of sports fans in the high school or the college, it's what everybody's doing. So why not try it, And the harms aren't evident to the young person. If you're losing money online, it's not the same as if you're coming to class smelling like cannabis or drunk, right? But you may be losing tons of money, but your buddy over here who's who's gambling all the time, you can't see the harms of that gambling when you're a young person. So, and it's often too late when those harms are really, seen. So emerging adults need education about the realities of gambling incentives and the risks associated with making decisions based on advertising, right? So just because DraftKings offered you whatever it is, doesn't mean that's going to be a plus at the end of the road. And I've heard young people that I've worked with at the college level tell me that those incentives are important to them, and they want, the introductory offer. So there are different types of emerging gambling types, risks, et cetera, related to them. Obviously, online gambling is a huge one. Most of the risk to young people exists online. But we also know that key pivotal transition when people turn legal age to gamble, it's off to the casino, right? It's that transition point, and that can often be an introduction to what later becomes gambling-related harm or problem gambling. Now, sports. I wrote a piece in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune a while back. I wanted to put in my piece that we have flavored gambling, sports-flavored gambling was a term I really wanted to put in the piece because it was sort of like, if you want to make the parallel to nicotine, it's cotton candy, vapes, and so when you flavor gambling with sports, what did you think was going to happen? That's how I think about it as a gambling researcher, and now everybody's studying sports betting. It's not surprising. It's really, in my opinion, gone off the rails in terms of how the percentage of the population that is now at risk for gambling. Young people now more than ever get introduced to gambling through sport. Or sports platforms, through teams, et cetera. And that does concern me, and I think we see that play out in our data. Esports is another one. Video gaming, competitive video gaming and wagering on that. Fantasy sports, notice all the sports. And social casino games is a new emerging area, particularly middle-aged women we're finding have this risk for social casino games, but young people as well. And then of course the video gaming gambling overlap, and now we have crypto, and we also have prediction markets. So there's just lots to go around, and I think everybody needs to be aware that if most young people are getting exposed to gambling in some area of their technology life. So in a study that we did, a review with Jeremy Ricard, who's of McGill University, we looked at the different types of gambling that put young people at risk for later developing problem gambling. And of course, online gambling was one of the areas we reviewed the literature on, and we did find that that does increase people's risk for young people's risk from childhood to emerging adulthood. So use of online gambling longitudinally predicted risk. And so we know, speaking of risk, that online gambling, kids as young as 11 are getting addicted to online gambling. It's not a huge percentage of the population, but it is there. I gave a talk a while back at Hazelden Bettyford. I had several people come up to me saying that they were concerned about people in their life getting involved in wagering inside video games. I was quite surprised at the number of people who had told me their young person or people they served were being impacted by this. I had done this academic review, but to hear people tell me in person that this was happening really concerned me. Problematic gambling, online gambling has been studied, but the new emerging forms of gambling haven't been studied as much. And this is an example here. I think the fantasy sports literature is emerging, but there's not a huge literature on youth. So fantasy sports are types of games that are often played using the internet, where participants assemble imaginary or virtual teams composed of proxies of real players of a professional sport. These teams compete based on a variety of things, including statistical performance of those players in actual games. And the performance is converted into points that are compiled. When we think about sports betting, it becomes a complicated web of decisions that young people are faced with moment by moment. And, having worked with and met a lot of our emerging adults and young people, they already have complicated decisions to make. And so asking them to make moment by moment decisions about finances in these platforms, it's almost cognitive overload. And I think that is a huge concern when we talk about risk. I'm trying to pay attention to time. Okay. Again, fantasy sports, small literature on youth, et cetera, something to look into. The risk to youth, while classified as games of skill, they are functionally similar to sports betting, involving constant research, real money wagering, and potential large cash prizes. Now we have esports betting as well, something I want to make sure that you're aware of. This is the basically viewing in a large format, typically people playing video games and wagering on those outcomes or those micro outcomes. And that's something that has been, I think, understudied in the gambling research field. And when we did the review, there were much fewer studies on the risk related to esports betting and future problem gambling. But it is something that did result in risk for future problem gambling. Now I'm going to turn to the data from Minnesota. That's just kind of a little bit of a background on youth gambling. So we're going to switch gears here and present the data for the Minnesota Student Survey 2022. And this is grades 8, 9, and 11. And I want to recognize the work of Dr. Randy Stinchfield, who has been shepherding this work since the 1990s in this state. And he has been an amazing mentor as he's passed the baton to me. And I'm also working with two researchers, one from Hamline University in our data science, as well as University of St. Thomas computer science and data science professor on these data. And we've done a dive that's mostly gambling related data, but we're interested moving forward in 2025 to looking at intersections between other outcomes like mental health, et cetera. We will focus today on 2022 data as we wait for the 2025 data availability. The data from 25 are not available quite yet. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sample demographics. I have to say that I feel pretty lucky to have a data set of around 83,000 people. Between that, it's the data range between 83,000 and 100,000 people in this data set. And when you're studying problem gambling, that's like a big win, no pun intended. Because every gambling researcher knows that it's impossible to recruit for example, problem gambling, especially youth problem gambling, because it's 1% of the population. But here we have a demographically rich data set, which is about half female, half male, grades 8th, 9th, and 11th. And last I checked, it was about 60 to 70% of the state's enrolled public school students that are actually engaging in the survey, so that's fantastic. In this survey, we have types and frequency of gambling. We have problem gambling assessed via Randy Stinchfield's instrument, the Brief Adolescent Gambling Screen, or BAGS. So the racial composition of the 2022 sample tends to be generally representative of the state's population, and that's intentional because the Minnesota Department of Education is shepherding this work and wants this to be representative. And you can see it's important that we have such a large sample because if we're looking at, for example, Native American youth gambling, we need to have a big sample there, and we are able to look at those types of questions in this data. So when we look at gambling types from 2019 to 2022, and this actually should be changed to in press because this article is accepted at Journal of Gambling Issues and is in press. We looked at the changes in gambling types by year from 2019 to 2022. And because we had some assessment differences there, we weren't able to have parallel assessments for all of these categories. But what we see is that any gambling went up just a slight bit. Most of these differences weren't huge from these two time periods, but that we saw some slight changes. And areas that we saw slight changes were gambling online going up slightly, any gambling going up slightly, but most of the other areas of gambling that were comparable were about the same. Now, of course, Minnesota is not a legalized sports betting state quite yet, but young people are being exposed to sports betting. And as we'll see in a moment, sports betting is popular among our youth. So in the current study, so we're transitioning to an article that was published in 2025 in JAMA Pediatrics. In this current study, we examined several scientific questions. What are the rates of problem gambling in our sample? What are the rates of engaging in gambling types among frequent and problem gambling groups? How many forms of gambling do problem gamblers in our sample engage in? So in this study, we looked at frequent and problem gambling. Frequent gambling as defined as 1 time a week or more. And that was about 8% of our students that actually gambled 1 time a week or more. And then about 0.7% of the students in our sample met criteria for problem gambling per the BAGS. So in this chart, and again, it might be a little bit small, but basically what we found here is that the most popular forms of gambling in our sample were informal sports games, formal sports games, and this is among the frequent gamblers, and as well as among the problem gamblers. So informal sports games as well as formal sports games, so betting on informal games of personal skills such as cards, video games, and pool, formal sports events or games such as esports, both of those were very common in our sample. So anywhere between 88.6 to 59.1% among the frequent gambling groups as well as problem gambling groups were engaging in these behaviors. And then of course around 25% lottery and online, and then 11%, 10% casino. So this is just among those people that are doing this behavior frequently in our sample, but it's notable to understand that this is what youth are getting involved in. And then when we looked at, which I think these data are quite interesting, when we looked at frequent and problem gambling, the frequent gambling group was often engaging in somewhere between 1 and 2 types of gambling. But in the problem gambling group, where they were meeting diagnostic criteria, it was way more common for them to be engaging in all of the forms of gambling we assessed. So when I really think about youth gambling assessment, I do think we need to be doing a better job at looking at the number of types of gambling people are getting involved in, and of course, how often they're getting involved in it. But as we know, the frequent groups could transition to the problematic groups. And what we didn't assess in this data set is gambling-related harm, which of course would be great to have, but it's hard to add another item to a large-scale survey. So one of the things we looked at in the Minnesota Student Survey more recently, and these data are not yet under review, is looking at racial differences in our sample around problematic gambling, frequent gambling, and any gambling. And I think these data rise to the level of notice, I think, for our state, but also maybe nationally. We find that African American and Hispanic youth in our state are engaging with, particularly, you can see that frequent gambling bar chart, which I think is probably one of the more important places to look, is that African American students are engaging in frequent gambling more than Caucasian students or white students, and our Hispanic students are also engaging in it more. Now, while we did not do statistical data analysis with a sample, we looked at the percentages. With a sample this large, the chances of that being statistically significant are quite high. Looking at the size of that bar, I would expect that those data are going to show up as very strongly significant. In terms of racial and ethnic differences in different types of gambling endorsed among our problematic gamblers in the sample, and keeping in mind that's a small chunk of the sample, we still see trends of racial differences in these different types of gambling, right? So I think this is notable, and we should explore this further in the future. And it tells us something about prevention in our state, but maybe nationally. And it raises up the issue that some people are at greater risk than others. And is this driven by race, ethnicity, and culture? Is this driven by demographic issues? There are lots of questions to ask, especially given that these are youth. So the takeaway from our data in Minnesota right now, our Minnesota youth are at risk for gambling and problematic gambling. We don't have direct comparisons to other states, but it is relatively common for Minnesota middle and high schoolers to gamble or to have ever gambled. And then the popular types are sports and games, minority youth, Black, Native American, Hispanic. I did not present the Native American data, but the bar charts tend to show that Native American students in our state are much higher than the other racial and ethnic groups. And those data have been shown year after year through Randy Stinchfield's analysis of these differences. And there is variation in the types of games that youth play by group. So we have a profound need for prevention starting in high school. And while a lot of young people may not have a diagnosable gambling problem at this age, still we're seeing young people engage frequently, 8% of our sample engaging frequently in some form of gambling. And this is underage gambling, right? And this is Minnesota, where we don't have a legalized sports betting arrangement quite yet. So I think we need to be taking note here that the coming storm is upon us, and we need to be doing something. Now, what does the storm look like? It might look like the same rates of problematic gambling. It might look like the same rates of engaging with gambling. Nonetheless, the coming storm could be advertising, or the coming storm could be marketing, getting in front of our young people and getting them involved earlier. So there are lots of ways that a legalized gambling state in Minnesota may change our situation for young people and, of course, adults. So I just wanted to make note of what the bag screen looks like. There are other screens that will be presented today, and so I'm not saying that this is any other, that the validity is better on this than any others, but Dr. Stinchfield has done a great deal of research on this screen, so you might check it out if you're interested in a quick screen for youth. How often have you skipped hanging out with friends who do not gamble or bet to hang out with friends who do gamble or bet? How often have you felt that you might have a problem with gambling or betting? How often have you hidden your gambling or betting from your parents or other family members or teachers? So this is really looking at problematic gambling among youth specifically, and then there's a little short scoring system. And I know he's done extensive research on this. One thing that it doesn't include is the definition of gambling, which I think naturally, as we're talking about and the experts we've brought here in the state can speak to, is the shifting nature of what gambling is. Okay, so, and then I think just an example of that is social casino games and prediction markets, right? Like everything is just, gambling 5.0, 6.0, 6.5. We're moving in lots of directions and it's almost impossible to track. And so to think about how do we prevent these things for youth is a little bit of a difficult thing to discuss, because then we need to know how do we want to talk about what gambling is with youth. So, and then I just want to be aware of the time. I do think there are a few things that do need to be discussed, which is, I think sports betting, being that it's a hot topic these days with scandals in the media and upcoming legalization in our state potentially, we need to also talk about how it's been built into gaming platforms now. The New York Times did a piece on the video game NBA 2K24. And the first time I looked at this piece, I asked my student experts, what is this? And they promptly told me everything about it, and I promptly forgot. But to be competitive online, players are encouraged to buy packs that may contain an elite athlete. It does remind me a little bit of Pokemon Go, but then again, I'm old. So they cost up to $50 a pack, and you get the opportunity to get your favorite player, and woohoo, yay, right? But what we don't tell people is that that is gambling, right? And so microtransactions are pervasive in sports games and are big business for studios, and they use these same techniques as casinos. Make no mistake that gaming platforms borrow every one of those behavioral reinforcement, psychology techniques to get kids hooked. And they build these types of microtransactions into these games in a very profound way. I mean, B.F. Skinner would be proud, right, of these platforms, because it is literally mind-blowing what they've figured out in terms of the reinforcement schedules. And now it's not even them figuring out, it's AI. Potentially. So AI, large language models, will be building these B.F. Skinner boxes as we speak. And what's better to build it in than a video game for kids related to sports? Okay, so I just want you to put 2 and 2 together there. And then what happens next if an entire generation of young people who are sports fans become swallowed up by gambling? That was an article in The Athletic. And what I think that is a big question. It's a question on everybody's mind as we watch the ticker feed on CNN about the latest scandal that could have been made for a Netflix special. So the media is picking up on the gambling crisis that we're having. Sports betting itself, the industry, is hitting a large profit margin here. This is just an older article. I'm sure the numbers have changed, but it's important that there's an industry behind the growth of this. And then, as I've mentioned before, AI is completely transforming all gambling platforms. And I guess, if I'm honest, the concern I have is that we are in a position, in a situation where the regulation of the use of AI inside these platforms is almost non-existent. Right? So it will increase the risks. The industry efforts may be ahead of the game in terms of how we, the horse might have left the station in some ways. Okay, so until we start to think about what are we going to put in place to either warn the public or consumers about these tactics or techniques, or put regulation in place, I think we're going to be in a little bit of a situation, and particularly with young people. So, keeping up on time here. Let's talk about population-specific marketing. As I was doing a talk, I did a talk at Illinois. The Illinois Council had me in to talk about some of the racial and ethnic data that I presented today, but particularly around Hispanic youth. As I was putting together that talk, I came across a report that I didn't know existed. I love when I find that's like a little bit of a gift for me. And I get to show you the results of this report, which I don't think has been shown in a lot of conferences. And what does it mean for prevention? And as we highlight this particular population, which is Hispanic youth, we think about how some of the advertising and industry and business interests are actually 2 or maybe 5 steps ahead of us in the prevention space. And that does concern me. So let me show you the report. And this is an example of population-specific risk in marketing. So I don't know how many of you know Nielsen. Nielsen is a well-known research group that does business research. I double-checked that with our faculty in business at Hamlin. I didn't want to present a report. I'm like, is Nielsen any good? Nielsen's the gold standard in business research. And they did a research study, and it was Game Changer, the Power of Latino Fandom, Unpacking the Passion, Influence, and Opportunity of America's Fastest Growing Fan Base. So that tells you something right there. So they looked at a large sample, and they showed that U.S. Hispanics versus the general population, these populations are growing, right? And the populations of sports fans were growing. So they wanted to get ahead of brand awareness in this population. You know, I don't want to say, underscore target market, but target market, okay? And there's also a parallel study on Black populations, African American populations, and gambling. And I don't know if it was on sports betting. It was done by Nielsen. I could pull it up as well. And basically what they showed is the past year leagues placed bets, the place bets on with Hispanic sports fans, but particularly youth. And they looked at NFL, NBA, MLB, MLS, and NHL. Okay, so that's interesting information, particularly among young people. Latino sports fans are 20% more likely to be live betting on the sport while watching sports. Okay, and as we've probably talked about at other conferences, live betting and moment-by-moment transactions and these types of things can put people at greater risk, of course. So that's something to be interested in. The media used for sports consumption, this is just sports consumption. TV, social media, video streaming platforms, social messaging. You can see where the U.S. Hispanics in the sample, where they found people endorsing the use of these different products or different platforms. This was also an interesting graphic. Sports betting activity among Hispanics found that there was variation in the wagering. 20% of the people in the sample were wagering $500 to $999, the 1,000 to 4,999 group. So it's kind of evenly split around these different groups of, not fully evenly split, but there's some variation there in terms of wagering in this population. And there's some pretty high wagers at a fairly high rate. And I think that's important. So what is this takeaway? Marketing and population issues may also inform our prevention approach. And I guess I'm going to go as far as to say a one-size-fits-all may not be the answer here. We need to understand what the population differences are within our youth population, perhaps our adult population as well, before we start to shape a prevention message or I think even program for everyone. So if certain groups of people are exposed in different ways or have different types of patterns of sports betting, we need to be aware of that and help adapt our programs to fit those needs. It doesn't mean that we need to make an entirely new program. It means that we need to be thoughtful and adaptive. So population-specific approaches may be helpful, but data are needed to inform our prevention and messaging approach. So do the data that I presented today inform prevention approaches in Minnesota? Yes. We can, at least say in our population study that Hispanic, Black youth, and also Native youth, who I don't have graphs on, are at somewhat elevated risk overall compared to Caucasian or white youth for gambling. The changes in gambling and problem gambling rates have not been tracked fully, but the racial and ethnic differences may emerge even more as availability and access to gambling increase. Now, we've already seen from the marketing study I showed you that there is a marketing tactic for certain populations. So could that mean that as we move into a legalized state that some young people are exposed more often or in different ways? Yes. Could they be exposed online? Yes. Could they be exposed by their parents' risk and exposure? Yes. So there are different pathways to risk, and it isn't just your phone. It could be that your entire family is now gambling on a new platform, and you're part of it. Or your cultural group has a very normalized betting environment, and now gambling is even more common because sports betting is everywhere. And I've worked with the Lao community, who I think they're here today, for the last 12, 15 years. And we know that Lao gambling, there's high rates of problems in that community, as well as it's a very common behavior. So some populations will have magnified risk as we move into a different environment. Now, we already know that kids in our state and other places are at risk for sports betting. They're exposed to it in their high schools. They know friends that are doing it. And when legalized sports betting does come here, we'll have to be aware. So are we engaging prevention methods that maximize our impact with young people? This is a good question. Should we start with youth at large or aim our efforts more towards audiences or subcommunities? There's a pro and a con to both, right? Culturally specific prevention messaging needs to happen because we already know that culturally specific and racially specific advertising already happened. And we also know there are cultural differences in help seeking and other things. So target groups versus the full population. This is a question around prevention that we need to be thinking about. Prevention should be practical, live, and applicable, and on point, and usable. It should be nothing like my college lecture or my data slides that I presented you today. And young people, we should have focus groups with young people and hear what they think of our prevention approaches and our strategies, as well as examine the motives for gambling and monetary gains. So the old messaging no longer applies. Don't gamble, gamble safely, stay away from these platforms. That's not going to work anymore, right? And so we need to be thoughtful about how to message this. We need to also educate on what to expect with ads and incentives. This is something that I really think is important. If kids and actually the population at large is being hit with these ads and these incentives, is that a point where we can try to intervene or prevent or kind of reverse the misinformation around ads? Also encouraging family conversations, modifying the messages around preferred gaming, and does prevention need to be targeted to interest groups? We've already covered that. So you've heard me say a lot about prevention, and I guess what I'm going to say today is we are going to be in a really unfortunate place if we don't start investing in prevention in our state. And I want to thank Susan Sheridan Tucker and the Minnesota Alliance for this conference, which is a truly needed conversation that we will have today, but also for the incredible efforts that Susan and her organization have made around the public advocacy for gambling prevention and awareness. So I just want to thank you, Susan. Also, on a national level, to embarrass Susan further, she is a field leader and she is a change maker in our state around problem gambling. And so I am super grateful for you, Susan. Thank you for your work. That's a long overdue public recognition from me, so take it as a late thank you. And then also targeted messaging for both genders and also gender groups with a focus on risk for different gambling, types of gambling and access. And we have field leaders here today to talk about differences in gender identification groups as well, if that's a possibility or a question that you might have for some of our speakers. And then increased awareness among policymakers and regulators. And I think in our state, we've come a long way. I've watched it. We have our challenges, but today hopefully is a new day. And I think coming together to talk about youth and emerging adulthood is really something important and that legislators and regulators should hear about. And then providing outreach and awareness to our schools, youth, and places where youth may be affected with problem gambling, and providing awareness for treatment options. Now, most high school principals don't want you to come in, or coaches, and say, hey, we're going to talk to your youth about problem gambling. They're like, what? That's illegal. What? Nobody's doing that here. What? That could shut down our sports program. Okay? That's a problem. So I always think about, what are we going to do to message that this is an issue? And the first thing I think about, we've talked about this, is digital technology addiction. It's like a proxy for talking about problem gambling. It's like the open the door. You know you've got a digital technology addiction problem in your schools. Did you know they could also be gambling? Let's come and talk about digital technology addiction. It's kind of like a sister to gambling, right? Oh yeah, we'll talk about that. We're not going to talk about gambling. So instead of talking about gambling, you can talk about wagering money inside of digital technology. Oh, okay. That's not gambling, the bad word. So another fun fact is Division III NCAA the studies on NCAA athletes suggest that Division III is at greatest risk for problem gambling. How many of you knew that? Some of the experts knew that, okay? But you go to the Division III group, now, I'm not going to reveal too much, and often they're like, But I'm not just picking on them, because it's also the Division I's. It's like, no, NCAA athletes, we don't have a problem here, right? So, and that's partly because they actually have to do something about the problem when they find it, because it's against NCAA rules, except for now pro sports betting, because we're not going to go into that. So that's a new change, right? So campus-wide tactics, what can we do? We're going to hear from experts, national experts today, on how can we integrate gambling education in our schools, on our college campuses, targeted outreach, campus-wide awareness campaigns. Here are some of the tips that protective strategies that we talk about: setting strict time and money limits and sticking to them. The word limits with emerging adults, that's a tricky word. The word limits with adolescents, tricky word, right? Limit setting isn't your forte. You can put a technological limit on your betting, I guess, but how long is that going to stick? Because you can override that. So limit setting is a tricky one. You can coach people. Avoiding borrowing money to gamble. Well, that's a no-brainer. Most people know that, but maybe there's, some things that people do that we need to talk about prevention-wise. Leaving credit or debit cards at home when gambling in person. Viewing gambling as entertainment, not as a way to make money. Sports is a great example of that. Video gaming, a great example. You get caught up in the game. You get caught up in the wins. You get caught up in the team. You get caught up in the social environment of, oh, my buddy just won $500. That's going to be me. So there's a whole conversation. And avoiding gambling while upset, stressed, and I should add intoxicated on there too. So peer education, training student leaders or peer health educators to spot the warning signs of problem gambling. We're doing that today. And also in their peers and making appropriate referrals. Another thing I want to mention, and you guys can check the website out on this, is if you Google the Better Gambling Forum, this is an event or an effort. This year, a bunch of us ended up going to the United Nations because the Better Gambling Forum is an effort through the United Nations Brain Economy Summit, and they're putting together a set of responsible gambling practice and policy pillars. This is still a work in progress, but it's called RGPPP. It's kind of got a catchy name. One of the pillars is education, informed choice, and harm prevention. So obviously, I think that youth education, prevention, harm, and risk reduction is critical. Advertising and youth risk is part of that. Regulation to prevent exposure to underage gambling, and knowing that minority youth may be at risk, and looking at the commonality of high school sports. And then, of course, problem video gaming may also lead to problem gambling, and we need to be aware of this. So if we have young people who are using gaming excessively, those folks may also be greatly at risk for problem gambling, because gambling is inside of 40 to 60% of gaming platforms at this point. So we need school-based prevention, as I've mentioned. We need to identify those at risk. Something that I haven't had a chance to talk about is the data that we find on psychopathology and risk for gambling. Okay, so things like ADHD, depression, and other mental health disorders that are very common among youth may put them at risk for gambling behavior and problematic gambling. And then, of course, reduce risk for ad-based misinformation. We do need to set safeguards in place for youth, including age restrictions on platforms, which is a really difficult and tricky topic because we have illegal platforms, we have people that aren't following rules, then we have to chase them down, and there's regulators involved, and it's very hard to chase an online operator down. Protections for logins. The data on this are not good. A lot of platforms don't have protections for logins, for age restriction or otherwise. And then understanding the gaming gambling intersection, and of course, marketing. So we want to rely on less incentives with the advertising. I think advertisers need to be aware of this. Ads should avoid using youth influencers. There's a real problem in the video gaming world where the video gaming influencers are getting young people involved in gambling on platforms such as Kick, and I think they've banned it from Twitch. But this is a really big problem. And then increased funding for youth and looking at various types of currency. So I guess my upshot is we need to act, and we need to act quickly in Minnesota. We need to fund prevention, we need to fund treatment and other areas, and we can't take no for an answer anymore because it's the coming storm. So sports betting legalization is coming, and with this comes other forms of increased betting and problem gambling in youth and high school and college. Are we ready? I don't think we are. And we need to prepare for data-driven prevention methods. We need to upscale our workforce in gambling treatment and prevention, and we need to educate our families, youth, and we need to get into the high schools. We can't take no for an answer. I spent the spring helping craft what are the evidence-based programs for cannabis use prevention, but the only reason I was able to do that was because it was in a legislative act that young people needed cannabis use prevention. We need to get ahead of this with gambling, and we need to do it urgently. So if you're interested in that, please contact Susan or contact me. I don't want a flood of emails for you, but I think we've been knocking at people's doors for years. We need to educate. And so here's my contact information. I can be a partner with you locally and with some of our national leaders to do this work. Please reach out. Be happy to come and speak to you or help you design prevention or counselor training or clinician training. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serena. So we have time for a couple of questions. Also, I failed to inform you that you should be filling out the evaluation forms. There are QR codes, so we would really appreciate getting your feedback as each session ends. So if anybody has, and we're recording this, so we will make these videos available soon after the conference. So, because there's a lot of information here, and it's a lot to take in, but so appreciate it, Serena.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Should have left more time for questions, but as my students will tell you, I speak too much.
I'm curious why you only focused on, and I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sure, Blacks and Hispanics, and did not include the Laotian community?
We've looked at the Asian American demographic data. We didn't have time to do all the data analysis on this. I largely did these data analysis for Illinois because they had focus talks on Black and Hispanic communities I was invited to speak at. So we still have to look at those data. And I apologize that it's not with me today, but there's only so much I can cover. But thank you, yes.
Hi, thanks so much. I was surprised, and if I was reading it right, at the 11% stat for, is that 8th, 9th, and 11th graders who were gambling at a casino? And unless I read that wrong.
That
but,
was the chart of maybe with
Yeah.
the frequent gambling.
Yeah.
In the frequent gambling
And
group.
was it of that population? And it was just surprising to me because, again, and maybe it's, I don't mean to
Yeah.
naiveness, but that just feels like one place which could have very, very low percentage if security, if, there was other methods of, allowing people in, because 8th, 9th, and 11th graders can look very young and not, too. Anyway, that was just a surprising stat.
Well, some 11th graders are 18, though.
Oh, okay, true.
I mean, so I'd have to pull up the data point. I don't know if you were looking at the JAMA article graphic, but if you were, that was just frequent and problematic gamblers. But yeah, I mean, that's among those populations. I'd have to pull up the data point on what percentage of our overall population is doing casino betting at these different levels. We broke it down by 8th, 9th, and 11th, but I didn't bring that in. I wouldn't say it's a gigantic percentage that are casino gambling. I think it's way more that are sports betting. It is way more that are sports betting. But nonetheless, there are some people that get in. And then we have to understand some certain populations are exposed to casino environments more than others in our state. Because of access, because of where they live, because employee, there's just a number of things. It's not that common. I guess that's where I went. I think the data point that you saw might have been from the JAMA piece, and that's among just problematic and frequent gamblers in our sample, which is a smaller percentage. But I have to look at the data. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Katty. I come from the substance use disorder world with peer recovery specialists. That's
Yes.
one of the things she said when I first walked in. Is there a movement, and our organization is probably going to step into this, peer recovery specialist? Is there a focus on that with the gambling world? Because it feels like we need to have that as well. I mean, we've got substance use, we have mental health, but this is another huge topic.
Susan, probably you can speak to that, but yeah, there is.
Absolutely, it's on our to-do list. Yep, we finally have internationally credentialed peer recovery training. So we are talking. In fact, I've got a meeting next week, and so we're trying to put this into motion.
Yeah, and
Adult level,
I
yeah.
would add, we need population-specific trained peer recovery counselors. So specialists, we have one. I think we did that work at least with one person in the Lao community, which was desperately needed. And then we need to be doing this in subpopulations and also age populations, right?
This is going to be our last question.
Hi, thanks for presenting. Do you have any stats on how many of those kids came from two-parent households?
We can look at those data in the Minnesota Student Survey. I'm pretty sure those demographic data exist, but I don't think anybody has looked at it in this survey yet. Do you have a hypothesis?
I would imagine mainly one-parent households or like divorces.
Okay. I don't know what the data nationally suggests or if people looked at that. I do know that there are demographic SES differences, but I don't know if number of parents in the household has been examined. So, no, I don't have the data in front of me, but it's an interesting scientific question.
Thank you, Serena.
Thank you so much.
Please give it up for Serena King.